Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. Andrea, thank you for being here. You get to hear two English professors talk to each other, for better or for worse. So let's start with some of what we read about all the time in the press, both popular and academic. We know that the number of students studying the humanities at places like Macalester is down. Over the last 5 years, I think, the number of English majors has declined by about 20%. And in 2018 at Macalester, we graduated about 70 economics majors and about 50 majors in psychology and biology, and we graduated 12 history majors, and 3 religious studies majors and 2 French majors. So let's begin with what you're seeing sort of on the ground as chair of the English department at Macalester. What kinds of choices are you seeing students make, and do you have some sense of why they're making those choices?
I think, well, the good news for the English department is that the English, like our English numbers are not actually very down.
They're not, actually.
They're up, to be fair.
They're not.
And the number of majors, so I've been at Macalester 4 years. The number of majors has stayed pretty consistent since I've been here, maybe slight uptick, and the number of minors has tripled. And I think that one of the things that I'm seeing as kind of an interesting pattern, and I've been trying to foster this a little bit in reaching out to other departments, is students choosing an English minor because they see it as a complement to some other subject matter that they're studying as a major. And maybe they're students who aren't exactly sure what they would do with an English major, but they are drawn to the English department. And then when they start thinking about the kinds of deep analytic skills, the ways of being articulate, the sort of thoughtfulness that they get out of their English classes, they often declare a minor and use that as a complement to an economics major, or I've had 2 or 3 computer science students in the last week come declare minors in the English department. And I do think that that's an interesting way to think about both what it means to be at a liberal arts college and trends in higher education more generally, is to think about humanities subjects and other, whether it's STEM fields or social science fields, as complementary as opposed to at odds with one another. Maybe that's a way to start creating a narrative that makes it sound like English isn't a bad idea, which I don't think it is. But I think that it gets represented that way in the national press a lot.
So what are you hearing from colleagues across the country? As you said, you just came from Macalester a few years ago. You taught at a very different kind of institution, large, not a small liberal arts college.
Right.
Are you picking up when you go to conferences, when you talk to colleagues, a sense of panic, a sense of worry? Because the public narrative around the humanities right now, and we'll dig into that a little more, but the public narrative is not great.
No, the public narrative is terrible. And I came from Eastern Michigan University, which is a regional state institution dependent upon, well, it used to be dependent upon legislative funding, but it's been largely defunded. Almost all the students are first generation to college. The narrative for most of the students there is absolutely one of employability, and I need a major that will translate to a job. And for them, particularly coming from families that have not got college educations broadly within their family, that often seems to mean a major that is a job title, right? So you can't be in English, but you can be an accountant, and so accounting makes sense, but English doesn't. So that's one piece of it. But then I had students there. I had this incredible student in a capstone sort of course who was an English major, who said she had spent her whole life in school being told, these are her words, those books are not for you. That there was this way in which reading things that were perceived as hard or old or literary with a capital L was something that she was not very capable of doing, and that she didn't have the privilege of the time to spend doing that because there wasn't a point to it. And she really wanted to resist that and to think about why literacy matters, for example. And she's actually gotten herself involved in this incredible nonprofit literacy program in Detroit as a result. But I think the colleagues that I have at Eastern or in institutions very much like that, which are most of the institutions across this country, are seeing enormous declines in their majors because of those fears about, what does this mean for a job? And I think national sort of educational trends that keep pushing STEM as the answer to everything. And I think those fears are, the concern that you have to be employable is a justifiable concern. The idea that English is not a good way to do that, I think, is something we need to rework that narrative. But I think the defunding of humanities departments, of the sort of loss of concern for those programs, the idea that those classes are not important, it's everywhere. And there's not one easy solution. If I could solve it, I wouldn't be here. I'd be, I don't know, working in national public policy.
So what do you say, or would you say, to a parent of a prospective student who says, look, it's gonna cost a lot of money to send my child to college,
Yep.
whether you're on financial aid or not.
And no matter where you go.
And most students at Macalester are on financial aid, but it's still expensive.
Yep.
They pay as much as they can, they take out loans, and isn't it reasonable for families to say, look, I want that education to be a direct path to a job, and I can envision how a major in computer science or applied mathematics or economics does that. I can't envision how a major in English or history does that.
I think it's completely reasonable to say, I want that major to be a path to a job, but I would push back against the word direct. Because, yes, if you want to be an accountant, if you love accounting or you love economics and that, and you can imagine yourself doing that for a really long time, I can't imagine we're gonna never need accountants, right? But if you're not really sure what you want to do, I think a major in the humanities is a major that teaches you how to think, that teaches you how to ask really hard questions. It teaches you how to synthesize material and dig for answers that are not the most obvious ones, do really good research, make an argument, which means synthesizing lots of material, and that is a path to lots and lots and lots of kinds of jobs. Maybe the thing you care about is public policy or education or the environment, or maybe the thing you care about is literacy rates or really bad urban renewal projects, or whatever it is you care about. But I think majoring in the humanities gives you some access to the history that informs public policy decisions, or human narratives about why we treat each other the way we do, or how those things might change. And it gives you a path to a whole set of possibilities. But it's not a job title, so you have to be willing to take that risk to say, okay, what this is going to do is teach me to be a really interesting thinker, and if I don't think I want to be an accountant for the 45 years of my employable life, humanities jobs are humanities degrees are the kinds of degrees that are going to teach you how to do the jobs that haven't been invented yet, I think.
So when these institutions were founded in this country, going back to the 18th century,
Yeah.
Going back to the founding of the University of Virginia or what became the University of Pennsylvania, it was very clear when you read what people like Jefferson and Franklin wrote, that they envisioned colleges as having multiple purposes, one of which was vocational, but that was only one.
Right.
They also thought of them as places where you simply trained your mind and developed your character and your values. and they saw them as places where you got prepared to be an engaged citizen in a democracy.
Right.
That conception now seems almost quaint when you make that argument to people.
Yeah.
Certainly if you look at our public policy, it's almost as if people think we can't even afford to think about those other two purposes any longer. All we can think about is education as a means to a career.
Yeah.
What are we losing as a consequence of that?
I think we're losing a lot, but I mean, first of all, we have to acknowledge that those wealthy white men thinking about what institutions could be and do had the privilege of an awful lot of free time to sit and develop their minds in a way that most students today do not, right? So you have the luxury of time if you don't have to worry about where your next meal is coming from or earn it yourself. So I think it's fair that we don't only do those things, right? I do think it's a loss to think that college educations are only something that we have to operationalize into a job, though, because then we lose a sense that part of what it means to be a citizen is to think about questions of public good. I mean, I think we've lost, you can see that we've largely lost that in the way that legislatures have defunded institutions of higher ed, right? They don't think about them as institutions of public, for the public good anymore. And so they don't get the sorts of funding from states that they once did. But that bigger sense of being able to imagine not just a future for yourself, but a future for your community and what that might look like, or to think about your place in history. I mean, I think that I think is sort of what you're getting at when you talk about what it means to train your mind or to ask hard questions. And it is a loss if we don't think about those alongside thinking about what we're going to do, because those are the things that enable us to do things that matter.
So one of the things that I think about a lot as someone who has spent a good portion of his career in the humanities is the extent to which we in the humanities have to accept responsibility for some of the fix that we are in. And this, now I'm going to sound as old as I am. But when I was in college, and even when I started in graduate school, it was still the case that if you are a reasonably educated person, you could pick up a book about Shakespeare's plays or a book about Dickens, book of literary criticism, and read it and understand it. It was still a time when there was a significant overlap between literary scholars and public intellectuals. One of the reasons that I chose Columbia for my graduate program was because it had a long history of members of their English department writing for a broad public in places like the New York Review of Books and in other publications. And for a long time, prominent figures in the humanities, mostly men, did that. And then there was a shift, and the language of the humanities changed and became less accessible. There was a shift away from as much focus on literary texts and more focus on critical theory. There's still a lot of debate about the whole notion that everything is a text and we can't make qualitative judgments. And a lot of people have a sense, and this is being debated a lot now within literary studies, that the humanities sort of willfully withdrew themselves from participation in broad public discourse and cut off their audience. Do you think there's any justice to that? And if there is, does that continue? Do you see a shift?
I think there's, okay, here's what I will say. Big theory, and it's sort of, you know, this 1980s and early 90s, like heavily theorized way of thinking was really exclusionary in all kinds of ways, even within the academy, right? There were all sorts of people whose brains weren't big enough to do this work, right? And there was weird hierarchies of like people from this institution they're the critical theorists, and people here do this kind of like softer, fluffier kind of work. So there was some of that, I think. I think it's justified to say part of the problem has to do with jargon and impenetrability and that sort of move. On the other hand, I think there's also a perception that because I can read English, I ought to be able to understand everything that literary scholars do in a way that nobody would say, well, because I have a body, I should be able to understand everything a surgeon does without surgeon jargon or specialized training, right? And so I also think there's a little bit of a public perception sense that this should all be accessible in ways that maybe it doesn't have to be necessarily. I do think that there is a shift that's happening now amongst like the more recent generation of scholars to push back against that intense sort of exclusionary theory with lots of really interesting arguments about needing to decolonize the canon and make sure that we include all sorts of voices, that if we're teaching a class on the British Empire, that we're not only teaching texts by white people about colonized people, but that we're also thinking about what are the voices of colonized saying at this moment in time, right? And I think that sense of expansion of voices that matter is part of a shift away from that kind of exclusionary thing. But I think that there are lots of other forces at play too that are going to make it harder for us to get back to that public intellectual model that I think you're talking about, which I think stretches all the way back to the 18th century, right? I mean, the sort of public speaking that was just expected of anybody who did any kind of thinking.
Right. So what are some of those forces that work against that?
The sense that humanities work is esoteric, I think, works against that. That people don't necessarily think a book about the history of tea has any relevance today, or a study of late 19th century poetry about the Emir of Afghanistan has any relevance. But I actually think it really does. So I think that this is one of the things that we have to be much, much better at, is talking about
why should we
our work
read
matters.
about the history of tea?
Can I talk about the Emir of Afghanistan instead? I think we should read about the history of tea because
Tea tells us a lot.
Tea tells us a tremendous amount about global economies and means of production and ways of thinking about relationships between colonized places and sites of imperial power, and those aren't the same, right? So a place that's colonized, people go out to it and settle there.
A lot of world politics and a lot of wars were driven by tea.
That's right. That's right.
So you can go on to the Emir now.
Oh, well, I mean, I guess my argument about tea is the same as my argument about the Emir, but I was just reading a friend's article revision today about the Emir of Afghanistan in the 1880s and 90s. And it's astonishing to think about the history of imperial British relationships to Afghanistan and to register that Afghanistan has served as this buffer and sort of space of tension for centuries, right? Which it still serves as today. And the ways in which Victorian poets are writing about the Emir of Afghanistan are shockingly similar to the ways that you see Afghanistan written about today, in terms of the sort of its own internal instabilities, and I think that if we actually paid more attention to the history of politics in Afghanistan, we might make different decisions today about how we handle our incursions into politics in Afghanistan. And
well, we don't study history.
We study history.
Right.
But people who make policy decisions
don't study
history. And I think that, if you want to make an argument for why people ought to do the humanities. It's, I mean, you can study the humanities and become a teacher or a writer or these very predictable kinds of things. But you can also be a far better public policy maker or far more attentive to the human costs and relationships of war or tea or trade or whatever it is, if you have some sense of the history behind those things.
Right. Do you see yourself as a literary professor, as an English professor, teaching students to make aesthetic judgments, judgments about what is excellent, what is not? I mean, this is, again, one of the, this is a kind of ongoing debate. One of the criticisms that is leveled at literary studies over the last 2 or 3 decades is that all texts have become the same, whether you're reading Toni Morrison or a comic book. Everything's a text to be studied. And there are not things that are of higher quality and more value than others. You think that's fair, a fair description of what's happened in literary study? How do you think of yourself as a teacher in terms of guiding students to what is good and less good qualitatively?
I think, I feel really uncomfortable with good and less good qualitatively, in the sense that I think that presupposes that our tastes for what constitutes quality are somehow objective when they're not, right? So we have certain ideas about how narratives ought to go and what makes a good one, but they're formed on the basis of certain kinds of repetition and certain kinds of training that we have, and styles of storytelling that we've been given more or less. And I think if you read a narrative written by someone who's writing not out of a Western tradition, even the chronology of the narrative is going to look different, right? And if we judge that as good, we have to ask what the standards, like what is the set of criteria that we're thinking about. So that's not to say that there are not aesthetically better poems than others, but I do want my students to think about different reasons to read texts, right? So articles in the London Times are not, as pieces of prose in the 1860s, as wonderful in terms of their eloquence or their turns of phrase or the sort of their prosody or whatever it is, as passages of novels by George Eliot, unquestionably. But they have a lot of use value in terms of understanding how people are talking about the news of the day. And so in that sense, all texts are equal in that they give, the more texts you look at from a particular moment, the more voices you have helping you understand what's the cultural conversation going on. You can still think a passage of George Eliot is more beautifully crafted. And so I think I would talk about craft, but I would then like to be able to talk about the craft of a novel written out of an Indian storytelling tradition or a Bengali storytelling tradition that might be a different sort of craft.
All right, so I'll accept that, but I think you're making it a little too easy. So
okay.
So we can.
I'm cheating.
Right. So it's I think pretty easy to say that our definition of excellence in the canon has been Eurocentric, has been male-centered, and that in opening that up, it's been a great thing to recognize that there are lots and lots of things, poetry written by women in the 18th century that's been ignored, non-Western traditions that have been ignored. But is it equally valuable, to give one example, to read, we only have a finite amount of time in our lives, and there is a certain amount that one can learn from every text, but is it equally valuable to read Toni Morrison and Danielle Steele? They're both texts, they're both prose, there are things you can learn from reading both. Is it fair to say to a student that if you believe Danielle Steele is better than Toni Morrison, you are wrong? Or is that simply a subjective judgment? Is there a set of objective criteria by which one can say that Toni Morrison is better than Danielle Steele?
I mean, I'm going to say right now that I think Toni Morrison is better than Danielle Steele. I'm not going to make the argument that that is not true.
But you're hesitating.
Well, I'm hesitating because I don't like to say to my students, you are wrong. Like, I would like to have a conversation about where the value lies in Toni Morrison. And I think one of the reasons we're going to spend a whole lot more time reading Toni Morrison than we are Danielle Steele is that there's a lot more depth to the text, right? And I don't think students respond well to a kind of pedagogy that says that's wrong. I think so that's just not me as a teacher. I would much rather say, okay, look, I would like to make an argument for why Song of Solomon is a better novel than, sorry, I don't know the names of any Danielle Steele novels. Fill in the blank. What a friend of mine used to call heaving alabaster bosom novels, right? Like, it doesn't matter, they're all kind of the same. Yeah, I would make an argument that this Toni Morrison novel is better and more worth your time, but it's also going to take a lot more time, right? And so here's why it's worth investing that time. And I think if you give a student a novel that's got that kind of richness, they will gravitate to it as better. I can't imagine anybody reading both of those and having access to anybody at all to have a conversation with about both of them and thinking, oh, this Toni Morrison stuff is trash. Like, I'm never going back there. Mm-hmm. But I think you have to dig into it in order to figure that out for yourself, why you like it better.
So just to bring this to, if a student came up to you and said, you know, this Lear thing, it's okay, but I actually think Friends is better written. you would or would not feel comfortable just saying, you know, you're just wrong.
I mean, you want me to say, yeah, I would say that, but I don't think I've ever said to a student, you're just wrong. Mm-hmm. I mean,
well, probably because the student has never said to you, Friends is better than King Lear.
I mean, maybe they don't come up to their English professors and say that. Students are really afraid. Like, you can't go around the room and say, what's your favorite book? Because or even what's the last thing you read? I learned really early in my career that that's a much safer question because they don't want to tell you their favorite because they're embarrassed. Right. But even then, like, they'll say, oh, I'm sorry to say the last thing I read was Twilight. Like, right. they don't want to admit that because they think I'm going to say that's a bad book.
Right.
You know, sometimes you want to read something kind of fluffy because you're on a beach.
Oh, yeah. Or
that's
a plane.
all right.
Or, yeah. So let's broaden the conversation out a little bit and talk about what happens to a society and a culture when people stop reading literature or studying history, and whether we're seeing some impact of that right now.
Yes. I mean, I think one of the things that happens is that we forget things that we knew, or things that generations before us knew. I'm going to steer clear of the political direction you're trying to go and talk about something slightly different, slightly political. But I think about this a lot in terms of vaccines. Actually, I cannot imagine any really, really strong supporter of not vaccinating your children at all has ever read any 19th century novels. But I think, you know, read 2 or 3 of them and look at the number of devastating deaths from things that I think we sort of have forgotten people used to die routinely of because we have vaccinated our way past that. And I think, you know, reading those novels makes you realize that you should be incredibly grateful for penicillin and vaccines and, I don't know, central heat, so you don't have children falling into fireplaces all the time, too.
Indoor plumbing.
Indoor plumbing is great.
I'm a big fan of indoor plumbing.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of indoor plumbing. You know, the cesspool in the courtyard model was not that sanitary. But so I think that not reading, not remembering things that have happened in the past, things that some of them that we've thankfully grown out of, like, you know, having to have open cesspools in most places in this country, we don't have to deal with anymore. But also in terms of our politics, in terms of our registering what it means to have really virulent biases against people because of their race or religion. Like, look at 19th century novels to see the ugliness of that, and remember why we thought we were trying to move past that, I think might, be useful.
Right. Well, this has gone really fast.
Well.
And we do want to, as we do at all these events, leave time for you to ask questions. So we're now going to shift from just the conversation between Andrea and me into a broader conversation with all of you. We have, I believe, one microphone, but Stephen Spohr is very fast. And so if you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand, and please wait for the mic because we are recording this, and the recording works better if you speak into the microphone.
So I'd like to ask about something that you said quite some time ago, Brian, when you were talking to the alumni board about students coming to Macalester and choosing a wellness model. So this is right when the Leonard Center was finished, and you talked about students coming who had a wide range of interests. And I teach at Portland State right now, and we're doing Fulbright interviews, and we had a young student today who's an English major who is returning, he hopes, for the second time to China, and he talked about how being able to explore his identity in a new culture through literature was really, really important to him. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about identity and who the new Macalester students are and the role of the humanities for them.
Ooh, that's a great question.
By the way, I just have to interrupt and say, my favorite thing about these events is what great questions you ask. It's because you went to Macalester.
So I will say one of the things that I have been continually delighted by and impressed by because at Macalester is the ways in which students ask really, really hard questions, both of me and the things that I know or don't know, and of the things that they read. In terms of their identities, I guess I can't speak to the old Macalester student because I've only been here 4 years. But Macalester students now are, I think, very deeply concerned about that question of their place in the world. What causes they care about, what connections they have, and I don't mean that in a like networking kind of way, but sort of where they feel connected to things that matter. And so I think one of the things that I see them being deeply appreciative of is texts that they read that get them outside of their own experience. So the most dreaded word, I think, for most professors English professors in terms of like what happens with a text is when students say something is relatable, which and I have this little set speech that I give my students to say, look, what that means to you is that you see yourself in it somehow. So the question is how, and then you can just drop the word relatable and talk about why, what is it that you see there. But I think increasingly I see students not looking for themselves in a text and more looking for some kind of understanding of other people's experiences.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, because it really is a good question. The process of watching Macalester students figure out their place in the world is both extraordinarily exciting and moving, and sometimes very painful. You have to, first of all, understand what the current Macalester student body looks like. It's different even than it was 5 or 6 years ago. So for the class that we just enrolled, that just started this fall, 16% of them are first-generation college students, compared to 6 or 7% 5 years ago. Of our domestic students, about a third are students of color. So for a lot of these students, just being at Macalester is a pretty profound act of figuring out who you are and where you belong. This is not a place where they have ever been before. It's not like they're all moving from a well-funded suburban high school or a private high school into this college. And so for them and for those of us who work with them, it's both exhilarating and also really hard. And sometimes they encounter these texts or these ideas and they get excited by them. Sometimes they get frightened by them. Their level of anxiety is very high. And there's nothing more rewarding, I think, for us than trying to help them through that journey for 4 years, and then seeing them come out at the other end with a better sense of who they are and what their place in the world is. I mean, ultimately, that's what we're doing. You know, more than teaching any particular subject, we're trying to help them figure out what their place in the world is. And it's not gotten easier, but it's gotten, in a lot of ways, more rewarding because there's more work to do.
So I feel like when I was in high school, you know, I was learning a lot, but it wasn't until I went to Macalester that I really learned to read and think critically. I mean, like, when I went to my first history class and was assigned 100 pages to read by the following day, I really didn't believe the professor that I read like 30 pages thinking, no way are we gonna discuss 100 pages. Yet we did. So I knew I had to keep up.
Yeah.
I think all freshmen have to learn that the hard way. But is it possible to not study humanities and be able to read a Marlon James book and understand it? Could you probably not, if you've only studied accounting and physics and chemistry and biology, you couldn't possibly understand pre-colonial Africa, could you?
I guess I would not want to say that if you've never taken if you've never had some intensive humanities study in college, you can't be a good reader. But I think you would be a far better one partly because you would have a better sense of what questions to ask, right? So you dip into this Marlon James novel and you register that there are centuries of history that are informing what's going on. And then even if you don't know that history, you kind of know, these are the things that I should be finding out, or here are the places that I might ask questions that maybe if you've only ever studied economics, you wouldn't necessarily know. I don't think it means that you can't understand the novel at all. But I think it's a richer novel if you've got those tools in your toolbox to sort of say, these are the kinds of things I want to find out, or here's how I might ask more.
What Marlon would say about his books
Yeah.
is that he expects the reader to work.
Yeah. Yeah.
He worked hard to write it, and he expects you to work hard to read it. And in order to do the work that the novels that he writes require, you have to have some training. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean taking a literature class, but you have to be prepared to do that work. And whether you've prepared yourself just by doing a lot of reading outside of any academic setting, or prepared yourself through your life experience. I mean, there are readers of his novels who've actually lived some of what he describes. But one way or the other, you have to prepare yourself to do that work, I think, to fully appreciate what is going on in his books. So, you know, he expects a reader who is prepared to do a lot of work, and depending upon your history and your background and your training, that work might be more or less difficult for you.
I'll address this to both of you, and it's a more general question, but I'm curious how, in the context of providing a liberal arts education, how your jobs have changed in the past 5 years or the past 10 years, or in your tenure at Macalester.
I think that the anxiety that you mentioned, Brian, is a big part of how my job has changed, that my students now are, in many ways, I think, incredibly great readers and very good at school, but they're overwhelmed with anxieties about the world, sometimes about their own, their jobs and their own complicated lives, but also about the politics of the world right now, in a way that they were not even 5 years ago. And so I feel like there's a lot more I think the job calls for a kind of, this is a weird word, gentleness almost, like a sort of acknowledgement of the ways in which people are feeling stretched very thin right now. People, at least, who are really committed to thinking not just about themselves, but about the state of the town or the country or the world in which they live. And they have reason to be anxious, right? I mean, we're burning up the planet, and we're burning up Washington, and there's a lot to be anxious about. But I think that piled on top of their own personal need to earn money for their jobs and I mean to live on, and the complications of their personal lives, like that all adds these layers that I think requires some helping them figure out how to navigate all of that stuff that I don't feel like I had to do 10 years ago, and certainly not even really 5 years ago.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. It's the biggest change has been my sense of the level of anxiety that the students bring with them to the college, and the challenge of, as you're educating them, also trying to manage that. I mean, this sounds like an overstatement, but it's not. I'm scared every day, and what I'm scared of is that something's going to happen to a student. I live right across the street on Summit Avenue from a whole bunch of our residence halls, and every time I see flashing lights go by, I go to the window, and every time I get a text at 10 o'clock at night, my heart stops a little bit, because among all the things that we are responsible for, we have 2,000 young people who live essentially at the college, and they are so smart and so gifted. They've never been smarter, but they've also never been more fragile, and none of us in graduate school were trained to deal with that. No. The people in the counseling center were, but when you go to graduate school in English to get your PhD, they don't teach you how to deal with student anxiety. You're lucky if they teach you how to teach.
I was just going to say that. I was exactly going to say that.
And so I talk to a lot of faculty members who basically feel like they have to get a whole new kind of training. Not only are they just teaching English or biology or psychology, they're kind of managing the psyches of students who see these faculty members as not just teachers, but sort of important figures in their lives that they go to with all of these issues and problems and stresses. And when I started teaching, I just didn't feel like that was the case in the way that it seems to be the case now.
I would like to just follow up on that question. Do you think that that is related to the increased diversity of the student body? That you have so many students who are first generational, and you have so many students of color who have never had the chance, maybe 5, 10, 20 years ago to have these feelings in an environment like Macalester?
Yeah, I think it's definitely connected. You know, I just had a conversation with a colleague of Andrea's who's actually in the video, Paul Dosh, who teaches political science at the end of the September faculty meeting, and he said, you know, I just love the way the classes have changed. My classes have changed over the last few years. They're so much more diverse in every way. They're bringing these different perspectives. The discussions are fantastic. But I also feel like I have to do about 5 times as much counseling as I did before. And so it is certainly the case that part of it is that there are more students, as I said, for whom this kind of environment is different and anxiety producing. But it is even broader than that. You know, even kids who come from, you know, expensive private schools in Manhattan seem to carry with them more anxiety than they used to. And so it is, you know, the increased diversity of the student body is part of it, but it's not as if there's a portion of the student body that seems immune to it. I don't know what you've seen.
I have a pet theory. I'm going to blame No Child Left Behind as part of it. No, I really, truly am. We have students now who, for their entire educational life, went through a system that was so, like, almost demented in its insistence on accountability that everything has been rubric-based and, you know, you do A, B, and C, and then this will happen. And they, like, when they're released into a place that doesn't do that, that doesn't give them this very tiny and incremental structure. I mean, I was thinking about what you said about, I can't imagine we're going to read 100 pages, right? I think about my son in high school who is supposed to read 1 chapter a night of his book. And if he's interested in the book, he wants to read a whole lot more than that, right? But there's this, it's like tiny drips of process. And then all of a sudden the process is read 100 pages and think about it. Of course it's going to produce some anxiety. Like there is an acclimation to different ways of thinking and different ways of studying that I think adds another layer to all these other things. And, you know, no matter what kind of other issues you've got going on.
I think we have time for a couple more questions.
So I have a question for the English teacher in each of you. So back to the discussion about good versus bad literature.
Yeah.
And implicit in that is there such a thing as the good, the true, and the beautiful, which sort of implies kind of a Eurocentric perspective, perhaps.
Something that's truly
So
beautiful.
Oh, beautiful.
you're teaching freshman literature, and you're teaching early 20th century American literature. What's on your syllabus?
Let's see. This is not a thing I teach. Generally, I teach 19th century British lit, so hence my hesitation. Early 20th century American lit. I don't know. Everything that springs to mind that even that's early 20th century, it keeps coming up is British, right? So Wilfred Owen's poetry, and I haven't had
You can count Henry James as American.
Oh God, do I have to teach Henry James?
No,
I
you
actually
don't.
teach. I teach The Turn of the Screw, which is a really fantastic story in my Ghost Stories class. I find Henry James slightly ponderous. I know I'm not supposed to say that because I'm an English professor, but I do. But The Turn of the Screw is great. I might teach. This is a terrible question for me. I'm so sorry. I don't know. I don't ever teach early 20th century American lit, so I'm just completely stumped. But if you'll let me say early 20th century British lit, I might give you some answers. No? Yes? Okay, easily. Virginia Woolf, for sure. I love to teach A Room of One's Own, which is this fantastic meditation on what it means to write and be a writer and what the obligations are of thinking through your own position in legacies of writers. It's got this wonderful sort of imaginative section about what would it have been like if Shakespeare had had a sister, and what would she have done? I love to teach Wilfred Owen's poetry, which is tragic poetry written he was a soldier in World War I. He was in the hospital with what they called shell shock at the time for about a year, and then he went back out, and then he was killed about 2 weeks before the war ended. And he's got really deeply moving poetry about what it's like to be a soldier in the trenches in World War I. And if you want to think about the cost of war, you could not do any better than teach his poem Dulce et Decorum Est, which is this really scathing rebuke of people who talk about war as this patriotic thing that you ought to just be really gung-ho to get into. Yeah, those would be at the beginnings of my list, at least those two. Do you want to answer this too?
No, I think you
Okay.
picked a good syllabus.
Okay.
So I think we're about, I see Katie is giving me the, I was going to say she was giving me the finger, but she's not. She's giving me the signal that we're about out of time. So first of all, please join me in thanking Andrea for being here.